what we're talking about in this panel is privacy versus progress, which is a slightly strange title, but it's all about leaders navigating regulatory change. Now, there's been lots of regulatory change, and our panelists will talk to some of the history of that in the past. I guess probably we're thinking about all of that again in light of AI. And people are starting to think about, okay, well, AI is great. How do I implement that in a safe way? Where should the regulation be? Is it within the companies? Is it set by government? How does all of that work? And of course, there's data that sits behind all of that, which has privacy and various challenges around that. So that's the general sort of topic that we're going to talk about. For those who don't know me, I'm David Crawford. I'm a fractional CTO, regular Compère for London tech leaders. This is my second panel of the day, so it can only get better, can't it? I'm going to hand over and let my panelists introduce themselves. Shruti.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Shruti Sharma. So at the moment I'm working at Save the Children UK. Some of you may have heard the general Save the Children non-profit, so that's where I am. I come from about 16 years of consulting experience in data analytics and AI, leading a lot of global propositions on insight-driven organization, and that's exactly why they've brought me into Save to do. So with all the buzzwords, that's what my title consists of: data analytics, AI, and everything else.
Brilliant. Derek.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody. Derek Gordon. So I'm VP for NCC Group. We're a FTSE 250 cybersecurity company, headquartered in the UK. In terms of my background and career, it's always been in digital identity. And that spans 26 years ago when I used to lug PCs around and do audits when people moved department, when people joined an organisation, and worked for Novell, if anyone can remember Novell back in the day. And so I sort of naturally integrated connected systems and then set up my own company, doing identity. And that was fun, but watching your son walk for the first time on Skype takes its toll on you, as the lack of hair shows as well. So I sold the company to PwC, ran their business for 6 years in the UK, and had 2 years at IBM. So here I am at NCC building our OT and identity practice, and great to be here.
Thanks, Derek. Lots of people pretending they're young enough to not remember Novell. And Stuart.
Yeah, hi, I'm Stuart. These days I am a salesperson at Temporal, who are on here somewhere. Fairly recently I had a useful job doing real things as well. So I've spent a lot of time working for startups in the data space, so data warehousing, analytics, data science, data security, and spending most of that time working with customers, figuring out how to implement those solutions so that they can make the best of that data asset. So yeah, very, very interested to talk and get people's experiences.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stuart. I think we've got quite a diverse panel in terms of their experience, how they might think about the data in their organisation, how they think about regulation might apply to that, because we've got not-for-profits, profits, etc., etc. So should be a good coverage. All right, let's get into it. And don't forget, please, any questions you have, drop them into the app. I'll try and pick them up and weave them into the conversation as we go. We're going to start off with our first question. And again, there's a flavour of AI here, but more broadly than that. Regulation, when does it hinder, when does it help? Is it something that gets in the way of progress? Is it the first thing you do? Is it the last thing you do? Where should it fit into any leaders' thinking when they're in a space that may have or need some kind of regulation? Why don't you kick us off, Stuart?
I guess the first question is, how do you define progress? I think there's different aspects to that. With no regulation at all, people can just get on and do things. But will that result in adoption? Will that result in people trusting what you're doing? In a former life, I did some work on the secure data environment at the NHS. And in that case, strong regulation, not government regulation, but self-imposed regulation, really helped drive the innovation and drive the ability for third parties to access that data, innovate on it, but do it in a trusted way. Because I'm a patient of the NHS, I really care about my data, I'm making sure that my data is secure. So I think in those kinds of scenarios, regulation is required for progress. Without it, nothing's going to happen.
But it's interesting that you said regulation is required, but it's self-regulation that's happening. In somewhere like the NHS or other not-for-profit sectors, wouldn't you think the government has some role to sort of mandate some stuff there?
I think ultimately it comes down to timescales in many ways. The government and extra government regulation will eventually come in a lot of spaces, but it tends to move very slowly because it has a lot to think about. And I think a lot of the times it is driven by what comes out of the private sector.
Right, okay. Shruti, you're in the not-for-profit sector. How does this feature in your world?
Yeah, I see this as a classic balance between getting a house in order, but also encouraging innovation, right? It's not a versus, it's a and. And I think regulation and governance usually comes with a bit of a bad rep. So it's the sentiment behind it is like a 100-page rule book now that we all have to follow. And it's quite, suffocating and people have to comply. But I think for me personally, it's about, clarity and light boundaries. That's all. So applying it to SAVE, we're very early on that maturity curve. So my vision and strategy for the organization is how do we even forget AI driven, how do we become insight driven?
Okay.
Right? So we're very, very early on. We're getting a house in order. So that's role-based access. Do people have the right access to certain data sets? Because we're a non-profit, we've also got some data sets that are very critical and secure, along with the right security, etc. And so it's around making sure people are speaking the same language, definitions. If something goes wrong, who do we go to? So that's what we're doing. And I think if we do regulation and governance like that, it becomes almost like a compass, like a direction, rather than feeling quite cage-like. So that's the approach that we're taking at SAVE.
Okay, I mean, that sounds like a nice balance, right? It sounds like you're allowing yourselves to do stuff and progress, but also it sounded like a bit of self-regulation in the form of maybe some guardrails and some thinking around that, right? Yeah. I know that as part of that, you're also keen to keep people in the loop, right? It's not all just about technology. Tell us about that a little bit.
Where do we start?
So how should people be involved in the regulation? How should people get involved in that? How should the processes work so that you get a balance of allowing people to innovate without holding them back because of too much regulation?
Yeah. So I see this as a shared responsibility thing, and I think we'd probably all agree in the room-ish. It's not one team's, it's not the tech team will do it or the data team will do it. I think very much when it comes to regulation and governance, again, I see it as a shared responsibility all the way through the organization. So I'll give a couple of examples. When we talk about innovation, I'm sure some of us, all of us, majority of us, I don't know, have rolled out Copilot, for example. A lot of organizations have. We did the same as baby steps towards. And as part of that, we ran promptathons. Okay, now in these promptathons, we allowed people to test their prompts and experiment and see the consequences of if there was ever a careless prompt that was used, what would happen? If someone was to, let's say, paste our organization data in a different channel, what are the consequences? All the way to taking scare tactic approach with the board. So talking about deepfakes, I think Nick earlier was talking about cyber phishing emails. So our trustees, our board members clicked on it and they put their hands up. And so it's an education piece.
Right.
And through that education piece, we've been able to sort of relate it back to them and not say it's about policy, but actually, what does it mean for you? How are you sharing this responsibility across the organisation? So that's what we're doing.
Got it. A very practical way of getting everybody involved, right? I also like promptathons. You heard it here first, promptathons. I've never heard of that before.
I like hackathons, but I don't like hackathons, so promptathons.
No, promptathons works. That's absolutely great. Derek, I'm not suggesting you've been around the block once or twice, but this has come up before. This isn't the first time. AI is just resurfacing this kind of like, oh, what do we do? How do we do it? What are the guardrails and all that kind of stuff? Tell us about where you've seen this before in the past.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I think in life you definitely see those cycles, right? And when I look at, I guess, a good instance where I think progress has been made, and actually from a privacy standpoint, it's been at the forefront, is PSD2. But before that regulation came in, we had open banking in the UK. And in many ways, the UK was spearheading the kind of features and capabilities. And essentially, that puts the control in the consumer's hand, because it's up to them as to whether they consent to allow that data to be shared. And the flip side is the service is improved for them. They don't have to take a photo of their bank statement. They don't have to hunt it out. I mean, I asked earlier, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but how many people here get a bank statement in the post? I don't. And how many organisations say we only will accept the genuine, authentic document? So there's an example where actually it's causing friction, it's causing hassle. With PSD2, I can consent to allow my financial data to be shared. It's seamless, it's easy, it's secure, I authenticate. There's an agreed time in which that data is shared, who it's shared with. I'm in full control. So I think that's a great regulation in the private sector, all around financial sector, where industry led first, but then regulation came later.
And I think that's a good example, but let's just follow up on the PSD2 bit first, right? So I was lucky enough, is it luck? I don't know, maybe it was a punishment, to be doing an implementation as PSD2 came in, right? And it was a ball ache, basically, right? It was like, and it's, you know, they moved the deadline a few times because nobody was really ready, right? And then we did it. I mean, we didn't view it how you've just said. We didn't view it as an advantage. We just viewed it as something we had to do, and that's the heaviness of regulation. Yeah. And do you think? I mean, I think this happened with PSD2, but you know, do organisations get regulation fatigue? Is that something that you feel you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely, David. I mean, it's interesting. I think you see regulation fatigue where there's a lot of overlaps, and that often happens when organisations work across international boundaries. And so there's almost like the same regulation, but it's called something different. Yeah. And actually, I think you mentioned, Shruti, around clarity and certainty. Actually, it's kind of like, is that the same? Is it different? That's what causes fatigue, because that's a lot of effort for people and teams and organisations to figure out. So I definitely see the fatigue in that sense. I also think in regulation, so I work in digital identity, and access control is a big thing. And actually, if you look at, you know, again, financial, the FCA, they'll have a playbook. It says access must be appropriate. And actually then it becomes more of a tick box exercise where people say, yes, we do an access certification. But actually the real question is, does that help you get into a more secure posture by doing that activity? And I don't think it does. So I think sometimes just satisfying regulation doesn't improve, doesn't help organizations progress. It causes fatigue, and it actually costs money, time, energy in people as well. So I think there's that aspect of just ticking the box.
And I think if I'm trying to be a bit more positive about my experience there, I think actually there were a lot of user groups, there were a lot of sort of think tanks who got together and said, how can we do that? How can we benefit from it? You know, and actually the user experience journey, everybody's really, really worried about that. And actually turned out not to be a big deal, right? So I think you can look at some of these things as like an opportunity to improve and to innovate and do that sort of thing. I'm just going to mention that there was, you might see me looking at my thing, that I had all the questions from last time, which are not appropriate for this panel. Somebody's hit a magic button, it's refreshed. I don't know if you submitted a question in the last 10 minutes. If you did, please resubmit it again. I've now got an empty list of questions ready for you to fill up. That's via the app, obviously, for this session. Okay, let's move on to our next question. So we've established that regulation is, sometimes a necessary thing, but also sometimes possibly an opportunity. It's not always bad. We should think about the humans in the center of it. And also it might be more appropriate for more industries. Stuart was mentioning health. I'm thinking about, everybody's really conscious and can understand, my health data, I don't want that out there, right? So, but we want to move forward. We want to progress. We want to do stuff, right? Whether that's AI or whether it's other forms. And I think data, we've heard a lot of people say it's not so much about AI, it's about the data foundations and stuff, right? And I think we want to move forward on those. But we must be conscious of protecting that data, of the privacy if it's particularly personal information, security around it, not just so that you can't get to the data, so you can't corrupt it, hold it to ransom, all that kind of stuff. How can we think, how should leaders, the leaders in this room, how should they think about an approach to saying, yes, we're going to move forward on this, but we need to make sure that we're doing it in a sensible way that's not going to bugger us up as we go down the road. Derek, why don't you pick up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's at the forefront of everyone's mind in terms of securing AI in the age of AI, right? And I think only this week we've seen a potential breach around supply chain of a very big software platform. And they're being held to ransom at the moment. And that's not through their security, it's through the third party's security. So they used a third party where that data was exposed. And so I think it's in all of our interests to secure that data. I don't think it's particularly hard because we've done it before. I just think it's different. And so when you think about at this time, we often talk about DevOps. We now talk about ML ops, and so really thinking about what's the security implications around how I develop and deploy, and ensuring that you've thought about that it's practical. I think the other thing I would add here is, bots have identities, bots need access, bots need authorization, and I think sometimes there's a view that that's all taken care of. I don't need to worry about it. But there's definitely a view around secure by design. We talk about that in industry a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's really applicable to how we deploy AI. And I was just chatting earlier on, I also cover operational technology. These devices were defined 25 years ago. Security wasn't at the forefront of the thinking around that. But actually, if we look at AI, the core model protocol, it doesn't have authorizations built into it. So guess what? It didn't really have security at the forefront of developing those core protocols around the language models. And so I think there's security gaps and weaknesses, and my advice would be to understand what those are and to have a plan for deploying and securing the AI services that organizations deploy.
Okay. So Stuart, in that way, who do we trust here? Are we going to go out and buy some stuff? I mean, we've just heard, supply chain can be a problem in this when you're using third-party systems. Or do we only trust ourselves to build the frameworks for security around these things?
Who do we trust? It's a good question. We've had a couple of conversations today with people about whether they trust their data going out even to the very large LLM providers, things like that. So it's interesting. Who here is kind of building their own AI solutions versus kind of deploying Cursor or something like that in the industry?
Show of hands for building your own.
Okay.
That guy over there.
One person. Excellent. So everyone's taking quite a cautious approach to things, it sounds like. And again, as someone who has my own data, I can't say I disagree with that approach in its entirety. I think you make a really good point about data security. One thing I will say from a former life, there's so many different routes of access to your data today that getting those guardrails as close to the data layer as possible, I think, is important, and having the atomic access to that data, because that really is where you're going to secure things. Because otherwise, you've got people building MCP services, APIs, reporting, all of these kind of things, training off your data. If any of those leaks, that's potentially a way that your data is getting out. So protecting things as close to the data as possible, I think, is really important. If you are implementing AI-based solutions, make sure it's really well scoped. Understand what you're trying to do, because that's really how you're going to succeed. And that's no different to people that were looking at implementing ML like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, however long it was. Give yourself a chance of success by understanding what you want to achieve. The AI companies, they've got it great. They've got you coming and going. You've got the LLMs, and then you've got the guardrails, which rely on more LLMs, and the evals, which rely on more LLMs, in order to get you to a point where maybe you've got some security built into the system. So yeah, be well defined, be well scoped, start small. The final thing I would say is everything that I've seen from our customers that have got things live and working and successful have all kept a human in the loop element.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's making sure that you are empowering people or that you have people that can reach out to assist those agents when they get to a point where they're like, I don't know, and before they start properly hallucinating answers.
And I think, you mentioned start small there, right, and keep humans in the loop. I think that's got to be really important, because people are just going to go too crazy in a world where our CEOs are constantly asking us to implement AI, or, if it's not AI now, it'll be something different tomorrow, right? Is just saying, well, what are we doing for? So be purpose-driven and come up with something and a goal and then try it. I also am thinking applying Shruti's law, which is what I'm going to call it from now on, which is promptathons, educating people, making sure that people know what's going on, rolling out, switching on Copilot. It now, actually everybody's done it, but it now feels a bit irresponsible. It feels like, there you go, we've given you AI, now go and have a play. It's like, what? Wait, play, what? So we'll see. We've got a couple of questions coming in, some more do good. I've got two in the same sort of bit. They're related to our last question, so I'll come to those in a minute. But Shruti, this all sounds great, learn the lessons we've learned in the past, start small, keep you. Do we even need to do this? Does everybody need to tackle, AI or the next greatest thing? Do we need to put ourselves in this position, or is it all just the FOMO and hype that's getting to us?
So I do believe that, I think in the previous panel we touched on outcomes and output, right? And I do believe that I think it's really important for organizations to take a step back and understand exactly where they are on that maturity curve. I'm going to use the word balance. I think it's identifying where you are right now, and that you might not be AI driven, and actually some organizations, especially the non-profit sector, if I can say so, is about a decade behind the commercial sector. We've got a lot of sort of work to do in that front. But that doesn't mean you don't encourage innovation, right? And I do believe that there is FOMO, because everyone's out there doing it, right? And everyone's talking, wherever we go, there's AI. I think there's so much AI talk that the government can't even keep up to it, and we can't, because it's a full-time job. So should everyone do it? I think innovation should definitely happen in terms of baby steps. As we are, for example, in SE UK, we've got our own sandbox environments, and people are building models, and they are trying to use different AI tools, and that's okay. But at the same time, it's really important, like I said, and I'll keep coming back to it. I never thought I was that person about 15 years ago or so. Governance and regulation, actually, just the guardrails around it is really important. And if they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So.
And I think I could see you cringe as you said governance and regulation. You were like, I'm not that old yet. I can't be talking about these things, right? But I think that's important, right? And that, that's the whole point here about what we're talking about is putting in those guardrails that you touched on versus just allowing innovation to happen. And I think based on what we said, you can have both, right? I think that's important. I think in terms of innovation and talking to the company, actually one of the things, I love the fact that the CEOs, everybody hates it when your CEO's walking up to you and going, right, so we're going to do some AI. And you're like, what for? What do we do? But actually, I've turned that around and going, yeah, great. What is it we're trying to achieve, right? And often, it won't go anywhere near AI. And we'll come back and go, oh, great, we can do that with a little bit of automation and some data that we've got. So, but actually, people are asking and they're showing interest. And the CEOs and others are turning up and saying, what can you do to help us with these things? And so that's like the starting gun for innovation, right? So I think that's a useful thing. It won't always go to AI, and we might have to manage the hype around that a little bit, as you say.
Yeah.
All right, so we have got a couple of questions which tie into our next question. So our next question is, in a world where the government won't regulate, whose responsibility is it to regulate AI? Now, the questions that we've got around this are, what top tips do the panel have for staying on top of evolving regulations and seeing around the curve? So my answer there is what regulations, but what's coming down and how do we predict what's going to be in place at some point? And then the second one related to that is AI regulation fit for purpose? If it's not, should AI manufacturers and adopters take a grassroots approach to doing the right thing, or should they make the most out of having more freedom? And I see that as perhaps, Derek, some of the stuff you were referring to of learning lessons of the past, right, sort of thing. So where do we go on that balance? Should we be looking to our governments, and who's advising the governments? Because let's face it, no, this isn't a political statement, this is just about public servants in government. They don't necessarily know any better than anybody else about how this should go, right? So how do we find our way through who's going to put that regulation in place? Why don't you give us a go on that, Derek?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. I think again, looking from the past, and if we take PSD2 as an example, open banking came first, and then regulation caught up. And what that teaches us is legislation takes time, and it takes time, particularly in a fast-moving landscape. And so I think it will catch up, but it's not. We're not at a mature state at this point in order for that to happen. So I think there is an onus on industry, on providers, on organisations to provide that and think through that. And so, a bit like open banking, industry was proactive. Industry said, okay, regulation isn't here yet. We're going to be proactive and take steps as to what we think needs to be in place to secure this and support it. So I think, precedence exists with the likes of other regulations. I think platforms do have governance baked in. So I spent 2 years at IBM and watsonx and the AI platform. I'm not in any way endorsing that, but that was baked into the design, and they have watsonx governance. And it's a framework that actually they're sort of forward thinking to say, let's be responsible with this, because when it comes to consumer confidence and usage and trust, that needs to be there. So I think some of the platforms are baking it in. And I think the third piece I would say is industry wants it. In terms of that security piece that I mentioned, in terms of the context, the consent, the access borders and boundaries, organizations are thinking about these problems that actually you will face. And again, so I think people should take confidence in that others are thinking about these things and solving these things as well. So hopefully that's helpful.
I think there is confidence and some comfort in that, right? Particularly as, not everybody has got the resources in maybe their startup or their scale up to sort of do all of that themselves. So the fact that some of the bigger boys and girls are doing that is pretty attractive, right? And I think that plays to self-regulation. And Stuart, I think that's something where you think self-regulation is important. But then I am still worried about it slowing things down. I am still worried about it putting the brakes on everything. And I've experienced this. I know, Stuart, you've operated in the NHS a little bit. I'm a non-executive director in the NHS, so I go to my board and I go, can we do digital a bit faster? Can we embrace it a bit more? And it's like, whoa, let's just think about this a little bit. And I'm like, come on. And interoperability is killing digital progression in the NHS. And, I'm not very tolerant of that sort of thing. So how can I balance that view?
With great difficulty.
Thanks. Excellent. Next question.
It's a challenge. I've also just sat here thinking when we say data, things like this, we've probably all got an image in our heads. I'm old enough that mine is probably a row in a table. But we've got to remember that data these days is now multimodal. We've got video, we've got audio, we've got all kinds of things. So I think that's going to mean that kind of government regulation is, if anything, going to come even later, because they've got so many more problems to grapple with than the problems a typical business has to grapple with. Most of us don't have to worry about video too much, apart from maybe processing it. So I think that's interesting. I think interoperability is something that can help drive standards and drive governance. You look at how quickly the MCP standard was adopted. The industry was crying out for a way for people to access tools for their agents, things like that. It was proposed, everyone saw it, fantastic. We're gonna go with that. And I think we could see the same happen with governance and with codes of conduct. I think things like this are incredibly important. Again, a number of the conversations today, do you trust the LLM companies with your data? Do you have a perception of how trustworthy ChatGPT or OpenAI are versus Meta versus Grok AI or these tools? There's already that coming along, and I think, you can say lots of things about IBM. I think IBM do think about trust and do think about governance and do think about that as kind of a core identity of their business. And I think that the organizations that lean into that are probably going to do better.
So I think that your last point about organizations leaning in or not are probably going to do better. I think, Shruti, you probably agree that the government, things are moving really fast, right? Do we think the government is going to be able to keep up, or the public sector? Should we just rely on the people who are getting it right to get it right? What's the balance there? How do we feel comfortable about that?
Yeah, I'd love to actually start a debate, but unfortunately also agree that I think whilst the government we're all playing catch up, right? Like I said earlier, we're all playing catch up. So I think the responsibility does come down to the leaders in organisations, and I think it is about embedding ethics and transparency and governance and regulation that we've talked about. I've also touched on that, personally in our organisation, where I'm going to bring it back to an organisation. We're navigating what I call the Wild West, and I'm sure there's other sectors too who are making sense of the Wild West. When it comes to, we're navigating shadow AI.
Okay.
Right, so a lot of our organisations have shadow IT, but we've also got shadow AI. So putting regulation around that and not necessarily fighting it, but rather acknowledging it, that it exists, it will continue to exist. And what do we do with it? How do we embed the lessons from it into governance rules? That's where we are as an organisation. So it comes down to the leaders and the culture that you're also building for an organisation.
And I think, clearly you three have you're thinking about this, you're thinking, we need to be, and to your point, it needs to be responsible leadership, right? Don't you want some help? Don't you want somebody, some industry body maybe? We were talking about that earlier on, Derek, other industry bodies. Aren't there a group of you who could get together and start helping each other? Because at the minute it feels a little bit organisation-centric, right? Feels a little bit like you've all got to work it out for yourselves. Don't we want something a bit better than that? What do you think, Derek?
Yes, I think we do, David. It's quite interesting, and do we have any reporters here from Sky News? Okay, so I can reveal this because there's been a few leaks from NCC recently. Okay. Anyway, we do a policy radar survey, and we actually publish what we see in terms of not just UK regulation, but the wider global regulatory frameworks. And it's really interesting what we think we see from a kind of government perspective around regulation. This is a shameless plug. We do release this every 2 years, and it's out in 2 days' time. And I looked at it, David, around just basically some of the key messages around that. And I think it would be very relevant to what you've just asked me, which is actually governments providing industry more with a toolkit around regulations than very strict adherence. You must comply with these things. And that applies around data security, it applies around AI. So I think we're actually seeing those regulations change. We predict that there'll be less regulation, but the ones that do stick will be stricter.
Okay.
So I think that's really interesting in terms of how we see that. In terms of your question about can we all work together, I think that does happen. I think it is happening, but it's maybe not publicised enough.
And maybe that's because people are still trying to work out what it means to them as an organisation, and then people are a bit sort of like, when am I ready to go and give an opinion to somebody else or ask for an opinion or something like that? But it should come, it should come. Now, we've got some interesting questions here. Let's try and, we've got 6 minutes left, so let's try and get into some of these, right? One of them, which I think plays across the bit where you were just saying, Derek, we can all start to maybe share and play together a bit more. Sophia said, how do you approach global compliance when regulations differ dramatically across markets? So we already disagree across markets, and now we're saying we need to work more closely together. Stuart, how do you see that coming together, or are we all going to be all territorial about it?
I think there's going to naturally be some level of territoriality about things, to be quite honest with you. I think there'll be a lot of innovation coming more from North America, where it traditionally does. Even just organisationally, the European market tends to be a bit more conservative and lag behind and learn from the lessons. I think that a lot of the governance frameworks already in place are entirely applicable still. Yeah. We've got some novel things happening, but ultimately, I think the core thing is protecting people's data. And regardless of the format of that, and regardless of what we do to have to secure it, that's still going to be there. So a lot of that stuff, I can't really see changing too much. There's always going to be territorial differences. Companies are always going to push their luck. I work for an American company. It's always fun making sure that seeing how the regulations are different and making sure that the needs of European organisations are accounted for when we're making things happen.
Yeah, an interesting time to work for an American company, for sure.
Oh, yes.
Okay, we're going to finish up with, there was a question here. I've just realised that all these questions are from the lovely Sophie, so thank you for feeding us, Sophie, appreciate that. I found one, now it's gone. Hold on, I'll get it back. Do the panel have any specific success or horror stories of regulations management, either from their own companies or other orgs? So given we're asking the question, who should regulate, what is should it get in the way, does it go? It doesn't have to be associated with AI, it can be something from the past. But let's go to each of you and ask you whether there's something that you've experienced that you found to be particularly good or particularly bad, whether that's self-regulation or centralised regulation. Shruti, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm actually quite proud to share this one, and it's continuing from what Stuart was talking about. So I think SE UK, which belongs to a global movement, we're quite tired of just individually operating. So my counterparts in US, and I work with SEI along with many different countries. We're all really tired of making sense of our own mini Wild West. And so what we've decided a few months ago is to come together and actually roll out a global standardized, we don't like the word framework, but just, again, like guardrails that we can embed across the movement, right? And that's not, hey, let's pick up Dharma and let's apply. It's something applicable, something relevant that makes sense for us, which allows people to have the right boundaries, right? Be able to experiment, but at the same time, speak the universal language. And actually, separately from SAVE, with other sectors, there's a group of us actually that have come together as part of a board, and we're trying to do exactly the same, and not so much of a textbook exercise, but rather let's take something and adapt it to what it could mean across sectors. So I'm really, really excited about that one.
Oh, that sounds great. Sounds like you're trying to bring the Wild West under a little bit bit more control, but not too much, right?
Control's not the right word.
Okay. Balance and shared experience, shall we say? Okay.
Yeah.
Derek, what about you? What experiences you got here, good or bad?
I think the most recent, actually, which is a really positive experience, particularly around UK, is the CAF, so Cyber Assessment Framework. And the reason I see that as a real success is what I'm actually seeing is organisations that have struggled to mature. Going back to your point, David, in the NHS, sometimes getting attention, things taking a long time. I'm actually seeing critical national infrastructure clients mature very quickly because they have to. And I think in terms of the world we live in today and the cyber attacks we see day in, day out, that's really important. So there's I'm involved in some of that, obviously, but I think it's great to see compliance and regulation make a difference, and quickly as well. So that'd be my example.
That's really good. Thank you very much, Derek. Stuart, you got anything good or bad for us on this?
I work with a few large financial organisations, and as part of that, we have to go through compliance reviews as a supplier to that company. And I was very pleased that we finished our annual compliance review a week before the next year's annual compliance review was due to start.
Just in time, just in time.
Yeah, exactly. We got it completed in the year, just in time to get it started.
Okay. Well, that's like a success sort of disguised as a failure then.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take that.
Depends how you look at it.
All right, so listen, we're just going to have, we've got some people in the room who might be navigating some of these challenges, who might be thinking about, okay, I'm going to go away, I'm going to be a bit brave, I'm going to have a promptathon, I'm going to start looking at how I can move forward with innovation, all this kind of stuff. What's the one piece of advice, just one piece of advice, that if they're going to get started in this area, if they're going to start leaning into this, from each panelist, one piece of advice, something they should think about as they do that? Stuart, let's start with you.
Think about where the value is. Why are you doing it? What's the result you want to get? You might not get there. If you're having a promptathon, you'll probably learn a lot. You might find a lot of things that you don't want to do. But ultimately, what do you want to achieve? What's the goal? Don't do it for the sake of doing it.
Brilliant. Derek?
I think, just quickly, organisations struggle with hygiene all around identities and access. Get that under control as you deploy those AI services from the start. So think about that secure by design, and also zero trust principles that you can apply into those components.
All right, that sounds good. And Shruti?
I'll touch on whatever we've talked about. So absolutely, it should be outcome driven. So what are you really trying to achieve for the organisation? And secondly, have we built the right culture for it? Do we have the right capabilities? So that's one element. And second, if it comes down to actual AI that we're talking about, so integrity, but also back to human in the loop. I think that is a very key part of success that a lot of people still don't talk about. So
That's really good. So I think for myself, I love the human in the loop bit. I'm probably going to nick a bit from each of you. I think I like the start small thing that Stuart said earlier on. Actually, there's a bit of me which is like, just do it, but think about it as you're doing it, right? Just, don't hide behind, the kind of like, oh, it's hard, it's difficult. Just try something, but be purposeful and think about it as you do it. I also think probably, read around it. Look at, go to things like this, hear about other people's experiences. We know that the big boys and girls are going to spend a lot of money on getting this right. There's no harm in riding on their coattails while they're doing that, but remain light and innovative if you're a smaller company, right? That's all we've got time for today on this session. Thank you ever so much. If you could join me in thanking Stuart, Derek, and Shruti.